Welcome to Up Close, the research, opinion and analysis podcast from the University of Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Jennifer Cook. Thanks for joining us. More than a century ago, United States jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes said language was the blood of the soul into which thoughts run and out of which they grow. But how much more powerful is that language when it is inextricably tied to the landscape, when it is seen as defined by the very place it's spoken? And what happens to a culture and a community when that language changes over time? Australian Aboriginal language expert Dr Rachel Nordlinger from Melbourne University's School of Languages and Linguistics joins us today on Up Close to give us an insight into the unique characteristics of Australian Indigenous languages. Dr Nordlinger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Rachel, if you could begin by giving us an insight into Australian Aboriginal languages over time. There seems to be this common view that there's just one dominant Aboriginal language and dialects that flow from that, but that isn't the case, is it?
No, that's right. At the time of English settlement in Australia, we estimate that there were about 250 completely distinct Aboriginal languages, and then dialects of those as well. So if you count total number of varieties, there might have been 800 or 900 different varieties, but at least 250 completely distinct languages.
That's a staggering number.
It is a lot more than people realise, yes.
And how does that compare to today?
Well, today many of those languages are no longer spoken or may be spoken only by a small number of old people or partially remembered by some people. So today we estimate that if we start with that original figure of, let's say, 250 distinct languages, perhaps 100 to 120 of those no longer have fluent speakers at all. Another 80 to 100 of those are in a position where they are spoken by small numbers of people, perhaps just a couple of old people or half a dozen old people. And then there's maybe 20 to 25 that are still in a state of relative health where they're still being spoken by most members of the community and learned by children.
And of course, when colonisation happened, the suppression or abolition of Indigenous languages was very much a way of controlling people, wasn't it?
Yes, well, certainly in lots of places and for lots of communities, there was very active discouragement of communities speaking their own language. Even well into the 1960s, children were punished for speaking their own languages in schools in various parts of Australia. And so parents quite naturally wanted to protect their children from that sort of punishment, and so would often try to speak more English with their children at home in order to make sure their kids were more comfortable in English and wouldn't get in trouble at school. And all of this discouragement of speaking traditional languages was part of what led to the demise of the languages in various areas, although there were other factors as well.
And it strikes at the heart of what makes language so powerful. Why was it seen as such a threat? Why was it so important that English be overlaid and smother these Indigenous languages? What is it about Indigenous languages and Australian Indigenous languages that makes them so very powerful and so particular to a place?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. So one reason is that language is central to identity and people's identity. So in that sense, the language of a community is really central to that community's sense of who they are, how they're different from other communities around them. It gives people a sense of belonging and a sense of connection with their heritage and their ancestors and so on. And so in that sense, language is really central for people. In Aboriginal culture in particular, there is another reason why language is so important, and that's because in Aboriginal belief, language is inherently connected with the landscape. So for many Aboriginal communities, the creation belief involves the ancestors, the original Dreamtime ancestors, moving through the landscape and actually placing languages in different parts of the Australian landscape. So the original ancestors came through and they pointed at different parts of the landscape and said, this will be Iwaja, and this will be Wombaya and this will be Murimpatha and so on. And what that means is that the language and the landscape are inherently connected. So if you're a community that lives in that particular part of the landscape, or if that's your traditional territory, then that language of the landscape is associated with you, and that's a very important part of cultural belief.
Now, geographically, Australia being such a vast continent, and for people overseas it can just be almost unfathomable getting through just how vast the desert is, how big those distances are. Where are languages most diverse on the Australian continent, and where are they least diverse, and what are the reasons for that?
There's various levels of diversity we can talk about. Across the continent, languages were all quite different. So even communities living near each other would still speak quite distinct languages. But when we look at historical relationships, what we find is that about 5/6 of the continent, so pretty much all of the continent except for the very northern and northwestern parts of Australia, all of those languages we can show to be ultimately related, coming from an original language that we as linguists call Pama-Nyungan. That's a language that perhaps was spoken maybe 6,000 years ago or so. So this is what we sort of can trace back and see that all of these languages may have derived originally from a single common language. And then in the northern and northwestern parts of the continent, we can identify there about 23 to 25 different language families. So there's much more diversity in that part of the continent than elsewhere. But that's not to say that everybody in the rest of the continent could have understood each other, because we're talking about historical relationships that go back 6,000 years. It's a bit like the relationship of all the European languages, so where we can see how they were all related to each other back maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years ago in a language that linguists call Indo-European. But that doesn't mean that if you're a German speaker, you can understand French now or whatever.
That's very interesting. So up the top there too, up the top of Australia, of course, you had more chance of the migration, you're saying, from Papua New Guinea.
Right.
Influx as well. So you had more influence.
Yeah, well, what we often find is that we get more diversity at the locus of migration. It seems to be the case, and it's generally assumed, I think, that people came into Australia through the north, and it's therefore not surprising that it's in the north that we find the greatest linguistic diversity, because that would be where the migration came in, and there may well have been a lot of migrations into that area, and then just some people moved across the rest of the continent, although it's hard to know for sure.
Now, Rachel, you have said that these languages are a bit of a spanner in the works, aren't they, in terms of not fitting conventional models of the structures of human languages. Tell us about that.
Well, at one level, all languages are interesting to us as linguists, because all languages represent a different way of conceptualising the world and talking about the world around us. But there are many ways in which Aboriginal languages are interesting and perhaps challenge some of the theoretical notions that have been developed based largely on European languages and other more familiar languages. So one example in how this can come about is in the type of information that gets encoded in the grammatical structure. So Australian Aboriginal languages are quite known worldwide for having kinship categories, so information about people's relationships to each other, encoded grammatically in the grammatical markers that you need to use when you construct a sentence.
Is this what we mean by skin groups? I've heard that expression.
Well, there are skin groups, although that's
something else.
That's something else. Skin groups are a way of organising society.
Yes. And relationships. And
it does manage the relationships that people have to each other. But I'm talking specifically about using your grammar and the markers that you put on verbs and so on to actually encode information about people's relationships. And Australian languages have quite a lot of this, I guess, compared to the world's languages. So just one example that I can give you is if you think about in English, we have a grammaticalised contrast between singular, so when we're talking about one person and when we're talking about many people. So if I say he is laughing or she is laughing, that has to mean I'm talking about one person. If I'm talking about more than one person, I need to say they are laughing. And that's a distinction that's grammaticalised in lots of ways in English. If you think about they are laughing, the they there, the use of they, all it does is tell us that we're talking about more than one person. It doesn't really tell us anything else about that group and how it's made up. So in one Australian language called Murimpata, which is a language that I have worked on for the last few years, we can contrast because in Murimpata, as well as encoding number, like we do in English with singular and plural and so on, the grammar actually forces you to encode whether or not the people involved in the group are related to each other as siblings or not. So, for example, if I'm talking about two people laughing, if the two people are not siblings, I need to say dimnginta kamba. If the two people are siblings, I have to say something quite different. I have to say pirimka kamba. And that's forced by the grammar in the same way as we saw with the English distinction between she and they. In Murimpata, I need to be constantly conscious of whether the group I'm talking about contains siblings or doesn't contain siblings, because I need to use different grammatical forms depending on how that group is made up. So that's an example of how the grammatical system encodes particular types of information, and in this case it's information about relationships. And in fact, Murimpata is at this stage the only language we're aware of that encodes a sibling category in this way. It may well reflect the cultural importance of kinship in Aboriginal communities that they do this.
This is Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennifer Cook. Our guest today is Dr Rachel Nordlinger from Melbourne University's School of Languages and Linguistics, and we're discussing Australian Indigenous languages. Now, Rachel, you've spent a lot of time with the Indigenous people of Waria, which is an isolated community southwest of Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory. Could you tell us a little bit more about this language that they speak there and the fact that its influence has taken over other languages in the area and the implications of that?
Sure. The language of the Waria region is called Murimpata. It's still a very, very strong language. It's still learned by children as their first language in the community. It's the main language of the whole Waria community. It's an interesting language in the Australian context. It's one of the few languages that perhaps may well have increased its speakers since English colonialisation, as opposed to other Australian Aboriginal languages or many others that have decreased in their numbers of speakers. So it now has about approximately 2,500 to 3,000 speakers, which on a global scale doesn't sound like a lot of speakers, but given that many Australian languages originally may have only had 50 to 200 speakers, we're talking about very small groups. So in an Australian context, 2,500 to 3,000 speakers is a large number, a lot higher than Murimpata may have been in terms of speaker numbers before English colonisation. One of the reasons for that is that Murimpata has actually taken over a number of the domains of other languages of the region. So there are various other languages spoken around the Waria region, languages like Marangar and Magatige and Maritjevan. Those languages now only have very small numbers of elderly speakers, so they're highly endangered languages. And those communities, instead of speaking their traditional heritage languages, are now speaking Murimpata. So what we find in this region of Australia is language loss and endangerment of many of those languages, but it's not because the speakers have switched to English or a variety of English, which is what we find in other parts of Australia, or speakers switching to Creole, which is a new language that's based on English. It's not because of that. It's actually because the communities have switched to Murimpata, so another traditional language.
Is this out of a respect for the land?
Well, one of the reasons is that Waria was set up as a Catholic mission, Port Keats mission, in 1935. And as a result of that, a number of different communities moved into the mission area and lived there. And Murimpata is the language of the area where the mission was established. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very fundamental to Aboriginal belief that language and land are connected. And it is appropriate to speak the language of the land on which you're residing. So it was quite natural that Murimpata would have become the primary language of the Indigenous people living on the mission. And for that reason, people would have spoken more Murimpata than the other languages, and over time the children become more comfortable in Murimpata.
So, Rachel, what would someone walking in to the Warrior community, what would they find there?
Well, there's about 2,500 people who live in the community, the large majority of whom are Indigenous people. Many of them can speak English. Children often can't speak very much English at all. They don't really come across English until they get to school in any systematic way, except for watching the footy on TV and things like that. Adults have some English, but they're much more comfortable in Murimpata. They're definitely second language speakers of English. The people who work in the shop and the post office and the council and so on tend to be non-Indigenous people, so they are all English speakers. So most people will use English just in those contexts and then Murimpata everywhere else in their lives. So as a visitor into the community, you can easily get by in the shop and the post office and the council office. It's often a lot harder to have in-depth conversations with people outside of those situations because then they're often not as comfortable in English as they are in Murimpata.
It sounds like a linguist's heaven.
It is. It's lovely, actually. The other communities I've worked with around Australia in the past have always been working in situations where the language is no longer actively spoken, and I'm working with just a handful of older people who are the only people who speak the language. And so the only context in which I hear the traditional language is when we actually sit down and decide we're going to do some work. So it's been lovely for me to have the other experience of being in a place where I just hear the language spoken all around me all the time, and I can't even have a conversation with the children without having to try and practice my Murimpata. It's definitely a unique experience for me in that respect.
Now, just how endangered are Australian Indigenous languages, Rachel?
Well, many languages no longer have fluent speakers. Probably another 100 or so that are spoken just by small numbers of people. There is a lot of language endangerment on a world scale. There are estimations that over the next 100 years, many thousands of languages around the world may well stop being spoken. An interesting statistic just on a global scale is that 95% of the population of the world speak 5% of the world's languages. So that in reverse means that 95% of the world's languages are spoken by only 5% of the population. And that population tends to be small groups, often marginalised, often disempowered and, under threat from bigger global languages. So there's a lot of risk to linguistic diversity around the world, and Australia is often considered to be a hotspot for that language endangerment.
Why does it matter, this linguistic diversity?
Linguistic diversity matters for all sorts of reasons. One reason that it matters is for the people involved. Language is really crucial to people's identity and their sense of who they are and their position in the world and their belonging and their relationship with their heritage. So language loss is really devastating for the communities involved. So at that level, it really matters. But it also matters at a higher level. Each language around the world tells us something different about the way human beings think, about the way they conceptualise the world around them, the way they talk about it. And so many of the languages around the world that are highly endangered, we still know very little and sometimes nothing about. So when those languages go, we also lose all that understanding and information about what humans can do, what it means to be human, what they think, how they talk about the world around them. And we also lose a lot of information. So encoded in all of these languages is knowledge about the landscape in which those people live, the plants, the seasons, the animals, the insects, so much knowledge that's very specific to those people and those cultures and those regions. And all of that gets lost as well when languages go, as well as histories and stories and mythologies and everything that we do with language. So it's quite devastating at many levels, I think, when linguistic diversity disappears.
And devastating when it disappears, but your work is helping to preserve it. So tell us, how do you do that?
Well, you do it in a very painstaking way. It's pretty much as you would imagine. I start by going up to a community, find people who are interested in working with me, and really often we have to start at the very beginning if there isn't much that's been recorded on the language before. So that might involve just sitting there and beginning with what's the word for tree, what's the word for child, what's the word for person, hand, nose. We just start working through the words around us, and then you build up into sentences and start to break down the basic grammar and develop a bit of an understanding of how the language works, and then you can move on to stories and texts and things that then provide much more interesting language. So we do it bit by bit. Part of it also involves developing dictionaries and grammatical descriptions, and also working with the community to work out what would be useful for them as well. So I've been involved in not just developing dictionaries and grammatical descriptions, but also materials for the school, perhaps collecting stories for children to listen to in the traditional language and in English, developing little picture dictionaries that can be used in schools, and anything else that the community feels would be useful for them.
An important part of your work is the actual documentation of the languages. Why is that so crucial?
Traditionally, Australian Aboriginal languages weren't written. There were no traditional writing systems. And so what that means is that they are transmitted purely orally, which means that when people stop speaking them, we lose all knowledge of the language. So it's really important just for records that we develop writing systems for these languages and write them down so that we can record the stories and write the dictionaries and things so that that information is kept, even if we end up in a situation where there are no longer any speakers.
What does that mean for future generations? Does it change the way the language is taught, is absorbed, moves forward?
The answers to some of those questions remain to be seen, but certainly it makes it a lot easier to teach the language in school. So when we have situations where children perhaps aren't growing up learning the traditional language as their first language, but they're still able to run language and culture programs at school that will teach them how to read and write the traditional language, but also in bilingual education. Some schools around the northern parts of Australia that run bilingual education programs, and then it's very important to have materials in the traditional language so that children can be learning maths and literacy and all the various other parts of education through their traditional language as well.
Rachel, thank you so much for speaking with us on Up Close today about Australian Indigenous languages and giving us that insight into culture and community as well as grammatical difference and uniqueness. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Up Close, and I've been speaking with Dr Rachel Nordlinger about the complex nature of Australian Aboriginal languages. This episode of Up Close is supported by the Melbourne Festival of Ideas 2011. For more information, visit ideas.unimelb.edu.au. Relevant links, a full transcript and more info on this episode can be found at our website at upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Up Close is a production of the University of Melbourne, Australia. This episode was recorded on February the 24th, 2011, and our producers were Eric Van Bemmel and Calvin Parham. Audio engineering by Gavin Neighbour. Up Close is created by Calvin Parham and Eric Van Bemmel. I'm Jennifer Cook, and until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to Up Close. For more information, visit upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Copyright 2011, the University of Melbourne.